My name is Anton Prakari. I am reading chapter 12 of Noam Chomsky's book, Deterring Democracy. Chapter 12 of Deterring Democracy by Noam Chomsky is entitled Force and Opinion. In his study of the Scottish intellectual tradition, George Davy identifies its central theme as a recognition of the fundamental role of natural beliefs or principles of common sense, such as the belief in an independent external world, the belief in causality, the belief in ideal standards, and the belief in the self of conscience as separate from the rest of one. These principles are sometimes considered to have a regulative character. Though never fully justified, they provide the foundations for thought and conception. Some held that they contain an irreducible element of mystery, George Davy points out, while others hope to provide a rational foundation for them. On that issue, the jury is still out. We can trace such ideas to 17th century thinkers who reacted to the skeptical crisis of the times by recognizing that there are no absolutely certain grounds for knowledge, but that we do, nevertheless, have ways to gain a reliable understanding of the world, and to improve that understanding and apply it, essentially the standpoint of the working scientist today. Similarly, in normal life, a reasonable person relies on the natural beliefs of common sense while recognizing that they may be parochial or misguided, and hoping to refine or alter them as understanding progresses. George Davy credits David Hume with providing this particular cast to Scottish philosophy, and more generally with having taught philosophy the proper questions to ask. One puzzle that David Hume posed is particularly pertinent to the concerns of these essays. In considering the first principles of government, David Hume found nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passion to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. David Hume was an astute observer, and his paradox of government is much to the point. His insight explains why elites are so dedicated to indoctrination and thought control, a major and largely neglected theme of modern history. The public must be put in its place, Walter Lippmann wrote, so that we may live free of the trampling and the roar of a bewildered herd, whose function is to be interested spectators of action, not participants. And if the state lacks the force to coerce, and the voice of the people can be heard, it is necessary to ensure that that voice says the right thing, as respected intellectuals have been advising for many years. David Hume's observation raises a number of questions. One dubious feature is the idea that force is on the side of the governed. Reality is more grim. A good part of human history supports the contrary thesis put forth a century earlier by advocates of the rule of Parliament against the king, but more significantly against the people, that the power of the sword is and ever hath been the foundation of all titles to government. Force has also more subtle modes, including an array of costs well short of overt violence that attach to refusal to submit. Nevertheless, David Hume's paradox is real. Even despotic rule is commonly founded on a measure of consent, and the abdication of rights is the hallmark of more free societies, a fact that calls for analysis. The harsher side of the truth is highlighted by the fate of the popular movements of the past decade. In the Soviet satellites, the governors had ruled by force, not opinion. When force was withdrawn, the fragile tyrannies quickly collapse, for the most part with little bloodshed. These remarkable successes have elicited some euphoria about the power of love, tolerance, nonviolence, the human spirit, and forgiveness. Václav Havel's explanation for the failure of the police and military to crush the Czech uprising. The thought is comforting but illusory, as even the most cursory look at history reveals. The crucial factor was not some novel form of love and nonviolence. No new ground was broken here. Rather, it was the withdrawal of Soviet force and the collapse of the structures of coercion based upon it. Those who believe otherwise may turn for guidance to the ghost of Archbishop Oscar Romero and countless others who have tried to confront unyielding terror with the human spirit. The recent events in Eastern and Central Europe are a sharp departure from the historical norm. Throughout modern history, popular forces motivated by radical democratic ideals have sought to combat autocratic rule. Sometimes they've been able to expand the realms of freedom and justice before being brought to heel. Often they are simply crushed. But it is hard to think of another case when established power simply withdrew in the face of a popular challenge. No less remarkable is the behavior of the reigning superpower, the United States, which not only did not bar these developments by force as in the past, but even encouraged them alongside of significant internal changes. The historical norm is illustrated by the dramatically contrasting case of Central America, where any popular effort to overthrow the brutal tyrannies of the oligarchy and the military is met with murderous force, supported or directly organized by the ruler of the hemisphere, the United States. 10 years ago, there were signs of hope for an end to the dark ages of terror and misery, with the rise of self-help groups, unions, peasant associations, Christian-based communities, and other popular organizations that might have led the way to real democracy and social reform. This prospect elicited a stern response by the United States and its clients, generally supported by its European allies, with a campaign of slaughter, torture, and general barbarism that left societies affected by terror and panic, collective intimidation and generalized fear, and internalized acceptance of the terror, in the words of a church-based Salvadoran human rights organization. Early efforts in Nicaragua to direct resources to the poor majority impelled Washington to economic and ideological warfare and outright terror to punish these transgressions by destroying the economy and social life. Enlightened Western opinion regards such consequences as a success insofar as the challenge to power and privilege is rebuffed and the targets are properly chosen. Killing prominent priests in public view is not clever, but rural activists and union leaders are fair game. And of course, peasants, Indians, students, and other lowlife generally. Shortly after the murder of the Jesuit priests in El Salvador in November 1989, The Wires carried a story by AP Associated Press correspondent Douglas Grant Mine entitled Second Salvador Massacre, but of Common Folk, reporting how soldiers entered a working class neighborhood, captured 6 men, lined them up against a wall, and murdered them, adding a 14-year-old boy for good measure. They were not priests or human rights campaigners, Douglas Grant Mine, the Associated Press correspondent, wrote. So their deaths have gone largely unnoticed, as did Douglas Grant Mine's story, which was buried. This was, after all, just one more episode in the savage outburst of torture, destruction, and murder the Secretary of State, James Baker, praised as absolutely appropriate at a press conference the next day, eliciting no comment. Another demonstration of our values. Douglas Grant Mine's report for the Associated Press is mistaken in supposing that the murder of priests and human rights campaigners receives notice. That is far from true, as has been amply documented, though too brazen an assault is frowned upon as unwise. The same week the Jesuits were killed, Central America correspondent Alan Nairn writes, at least 28 other civilians were murdered in similar fashion. Among them were the head of the Waterworks Union, the leader of the Organization of University Women, 9 members of an Indian farming cooperative, and 10 university students. Moreover, serious investigation of the Salvadoran murders leads directly to Washington's doorstep. All absolutely appropriate, hence unworthy of mention or concern. So the story continues, week after grisly week. The comparison between the Soviet and US satellites is so striking and obvious that it takes real dedication not to perceive it. And outside of Western intellectual circles, it is a commonplace. A writer in the Mexican daily Excelsior, describing how US relations with Latin America deteriorated through the 1980s, comments on the striking contrast between Soviet behavior towards its satellites and US policy in the Western Hemisphere, where intransigence, interventionism, and the application of typical police state instruments have traditionally marked Washington's actions. In Europe, the USSR and Gorbachev are associated with the struggle for freedom of travel, political rights, and the respect for public opinion. In the Americas, the U.S. and Bush are associated with indiscriminate bombings of civilians, the organization, training, and financing of death squads, and programs of mass murder. Not quite the story in New York and Washington, where the United States is hailed as an inspiration for the triumph of democracy in our time, the new republic. In El Salvador, the journal Proceso of the Jesuit University observed, the so-called Salvadoran democratic process could learn a lot from the capacity for self-criticism that the socialist nations are demonstrating. If Lech Walesa had been doing his organizing work in El Salvador, he would have already entered into the ranks of the disappeared at the hands of heavily armed men dressed in civilian clothes, or have been blown to pieces in a dynamite attack on his union headquarters. If Alexander Dubček were a politician in our country, he would have been assassinated like Hector Oqueli, the social democratic leader assassinated in Guatemala by Salvadoran death squads, according to the Guatemalan government. If Andrei Sakharov had worked here in favor of human rights, he would have met the same fate as Herbert Anaya, one of the many murdered leaders of the independent Salvadoran Human Rights Commission, CDHES. If Otasik or Václav Havel had been carrying out their intellectual work in El Salvador, they would have woken up one sinister morning, lying on the patio of a university campus with their heads destroyed by the bullets of an elite army battalion. The comparison was broadened in a seminar on Christian opportunity and mission held by the Latin American Council of Churches in San Jose, Costa Rica, reported in Mexico's leading daily. Participants contrasted positive developments in the Soviet Union and its domains with the circumstances of Central America, marked by United States intervention and the rightward turn of control of government power. The pastoral letter Hope Against Hope, announced at the end of the meeting, went on to say that in this context, military, institutional, financial, political, and cultural power, means of communication, as well as the power of some churches indifferent to social problems, will be deployed with greater force in Central America, with serious consequences for the impoverished majority majority. The reference is presumably to the fundamentalist churches backed by the United States in an effort to divert the poor population from any struggle for amelioration of the conditions of this meaningless life on Earth. The decade of the 1980s was notable in the region for the growth of the gap between rich and poor, a political rightward turn, and a conservative offensive on the economic front. The goal of the Central American peace plan was to put the Nicaraguan revolution on neoliberal democracy tracks and to defend governments such as the Salvadoran. With these results achieved, the US-backed regimes and their sponsor will bury the demands about human rights and social justice. The same comparison was drawn by the Guatemalan journalist Julio Godoy after a brief visit to Guatemala. He had fled a year earlier when his newspaper La Época was blown up by state terrorists, an operation that aroused no interest in the United States. It was not reported, though well known. At the time, the media were much exercised over the fact that the US-funded journal La Prensa, which was openly aligned with the US-run forces attacking Nicaragua, had missed an issue because of a shortage of newsprint, an atrocity that led to passionate diatribes about Sandinista totalitarianism. In the face of this crime, Western commentators could hardly be expected to notice that the US-backed security forces had silenced the one small independent voice in Guatemala in their usual fashion. This is simply another illustration of the total contempt for freedom of the press in Western circles, revealed as well by the silence that accompanies the violent destruction of the independent Salvadoran press by state terror, the routine closure of newspapers under absurd pretexts, and the arrest and torture of journalists in the Israeli-occupied territories and sometimes in Israel proper, the storming of the headquarters of a major South Korean broadcasting network by riot police to arrest the leader of the union on the charge that he had organized labor protests, and other such contributions to order and good form. Eastern Europeans are in a way luckier than Central Americans, Julio Godoy wrote. While the Moscow-imposed government in Prague would degrade and humiliate reformers, the Washington-made government in Guatemala would kill them. It still does, in a virtual genocide that has taken more than 150,000 victims in what Amnesty International calls a government program of political murder. That, Julio Godoy suggested, is the main explanation for the fearless character of the students' recent uprising in Prague. The Czechoslovak army doesn't shoot to kill. In Guatemala, not to mention El Salvador, random terror is used to keep unions and peasant associations from seeking their own way, and to ensure that the press conforms or disappears, so that Western liberals need not fret over censorship in the fledgling democracy as they applaud. There is an important difference in the nature of the armies and of their foreign tutors. In the Soviet satellites, the armies are apolitical and obedient to their national government, while in the US satellites, the army is the power, doing what they have been trained to do for many decades by their foreign tutor. One is tempted to believe that some people in the White House worship Aztec gods with the offering of Central American blood. They, being the United States, backed forces in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that can easily compete against Nicolae Ceausescu's Securitate for the World Cruelty Prize. Julio Godoy quotes a European diplomat who says, "As long as the Americans don't change their attitudes towards the region, there's no space here for the truth or for hope. Surely no space for nonviolence and love." One will search far to find such truisms in U.S. commentary, or the West in general, which much prefers largely meaningless, though self-flattering, comparisons between Eastern and Western Europe. Nor is the hideous catastrophe of capitalism in the past years a major theme of contemporary discourse. A catastrophe that is dramatic in Latin America and other domains of the individual West, in the internal third world of the United States, and the exported slums of Europe. Nor are we likely to find much attention to the fact, hard to ignore, that the economic success stories typically involve coordination of the state and financial industrial conglomerates, another sign of the collapse of capitalism in the past 60 years. It is only the third world that is to be subjected to the destructive forces of free market capitalism so that it can be more efficiently robbed and exploited by the powerful. Central America represents the historical norm, not Eastern Europe. Hume's observation requires this correction, recognizing that it remains true and important that government is typically founded on modes of submission short of force, even where force is available as a last resort. In the contemporary period, Hume's insight has been revived and elaborated, but with a crucial innovation. Control of thought is more important for governments that are free and popular than for despotic and military states. The logic is straightforward. A despotic state controls its domestic enemy by force. But as the state loses this weapon, other devices are required to prevent the ignorant masses from interfering with public affairs, which are none of their business. These prominent features of modern political and intellectual culture permit a closer look. The problem of putting the public in its place came to the fore with what one historian calls the first great outburst of democratic thought in history, the English Revolution in the 17th century. This awakening of the general populace raised the problem of how to contain the threat. The libertarian ideas of the radical Democrats were considered outrageous by respectable people. They favored universal education, guaranteed health care, and democratization of the law, which one described the law as a fox with poor men, the geese. He pulls off their feathers and feeds upon them. They developed a kind of libertarian theology, which, as one critic ominously observed, preached seditious doctrine to the people and aimed to raise the rascal multitude against all men of best quality in the kingdom, to draw them into associations and combinations with one another, against all lords, gentry, ministers, lawyers, rich and peaceable men. Historian Clement Walker. Particularly frightening were the itinerant workers and preachers calling for freedom and democracy, the agitators stirring up the rascal multitude, and the printers putting out pamphlets questioning authority and its mysteries. There can be no form of government without its proper mysteries, Clement Walker warned, mysteries that must be concealed from the common folk. Ignorance and admiration arising from ignorance are the parents of civil devotion and obedience, a thought echoed by Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. The radical Democrats had cast all the mysteries and secrets of government before the vulgar like pearls before swine, he continued, and had made the people thereby so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. It is dangerous, another commentator ominously observed, to have a people know their own strength. The rabble did not want to be ruled by king or parliament, but by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants. Their pamphlets explain further that it will never be a good world while knights and gentlemen make us laws that are chosen for fear and do but oppress us, and do not know the people's sores. These ideas naturally appalled the men of best quality. They were willing to grant the people rights, but within reason, and on the principle that when we mention the people, we do not mean the confused, promiscuous body of the people. After the Democrats had been defeated, John Locke commented that day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and dairymaids, must be told what to believe. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. Like John Milton and other civil libertarians of the period, John Locke held a sharply limited conception of freedom of expression. His fundamental Constitution of Carolina barred those who speak anything in their religious assembly irreverently or seditiously of the government or governors or of state matters. The Constitution granted freedom for speculative opinions in religion, but not for political opinions. Locke would not even have permitted people to discuss public affairs, Leonard Levy observes. The Constitution provided further that all manner of comments and expositions on any part of these constitutions or on any part of common or statute laws of Carolines are absolutely prohibited. In drafting reasons for Parliament to terminate censorship in 1694, John Locke offered no defense of freedom of expression or thought, but only considerations of expediency and harm to commercial interests. With the threat of democracy overcome and the libertarian rabble dispersed, censorship was permitted to lapse in England because the opinion formers censored themselves. Nothing got into print which frightened the men of property, Christopher Hill comments. In a well-functioning state capitalist democracy like the United States, what might frighten the men of property is generally kept far from the public eye, sometimes with quite astonishing success. Such ideas have ample resonance until today, including John Locke's stern doctrine that the common people should be denied the right even to discuss public affairs. This doctrine remains a basic principle of modern democratic states, now implemented by a variety of means to protect the operations of the state from public scrutiny. Classification of documents on the largely fraudulent pretext of national security, clandestine operations, and other measures to bar the rascal multitude from the political arena. Such devices typically gain new force under the regime of statist reactionaries of the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher variety. The same ideas frame the essential professional task and responsibility of the intellectual community to shape the perceived historical record and the picture of the contemporary world in the interests of the powerful, thus ensuring that the public, properly bewildered, keeps to its place and function. In the 1670s, supporters of Parliament and the army against the people easily proved that the rabble could not be trusted. This was shown by their lingering monarchist sentiments and their reluctance to place their affairs in the hands of the gentry and the army, who were truly the people, though the people in their foolishness did not agree. The mass of the people are a giddy multitude, beasts in men's shapes. It is proper to suppress them, just as it is proper to save the life of a lunatic or distracted person, even against his will. If the people are so depraved and corrupt as to confer places of power and trust upon wicked and undeserving men, they forfeit their power in this behalf unto those that are good, though but a few. The good and few may be the gentry or industrialists, or the vanguard party in the Central Committee, or the intellectuals who qualify as experts because they articulate the consensus of the powerful, to paraphrase one of Henry Kissinger's insights. They manage the business empires, ideological institutions, and political structures, or serve them at various levels. Their task is to shepherd the bewildered herd and keep the giddy multitude in a state of implicit submission, and thus to bar the dreaded prospect of freedom and self-determination. Similar ideas had been forged as the Spanish explorers set about what Tisvetin Todorov calls the greatest genocide in human history after they discovered America 500 years ago. They justified their acts of terror and oppression on the grounds that the natives are not capable of governing themselves any more than madmen or even wild beasts and animals, seeing that their food is not any more agreeable and scarcely better than that of wild beasts, and their stupidity is much greater than that of children and madmen in other countries. Professor and theologian Francisco de Vitoria, one of the pinnacles of Spanish humanism in the 16th century. Therefore, intervention is legitimate in order to exercise the rights of guardianship, Tisvetin Todorov comments, summarizing Francisco de Vitoria's basic thought. When English savages took over the task a few years later, they naturally adopted the same pose while taming the wolves in the guise of men, as George Washington described the objects that stood in the way of the advance of civilization and had to be eliminated for their own good. The English colonists had already handled the Celtic wild men the same way, for example, when Lord Cumberland, known as the Butcher, laid waste to the Scottish Highlands before moving on to pursue his craft in North America. 150 years later, their descendants had purged North America of this native blight, reducing the lunatics from 10 million to 200,000, according to some recent estimates. And they turned their eyes elsewhere to civilize the wild beasts in the Philippines. The Indian fighters, to whom President McKinley assigned the task of Christianizing and uplifting these unfortunate creatures, rid the liberated islands of hundreds of thousands of them, accelerating their ascent to heaven. They too were rescuing misguided creatures from their depravity by slaughtering the natives in English fashion, as the New York press described their painful responsibility, adding that we must take what muddy glory lies in the wholesale killing till they have learned to respect our arms, then moving on to the more difficult task of getting them to respect our intentions. This is pretty much the course of history as the plague of European civilization devastated much of the world. On the home front, the continuing problem was formulated plainly by the 17th century political thinker Marchemont Needham. The proposals of the radical Democrats, he wrote, would result in ignorant persons, neither of learning nor fortune, being put in authority. Given their freedom, the self-opinionated multitude would elect the lowest of the people, who would occupy themselves with milking and gelding the purses of the rich, taking the ready road to all licentiousness, mischief, mere anarchy and confusion. These sentiments are the common coin of modern political and intellectual discourse, increasingly so as popular struggles did succeed over the centuries in realizing the proposals of the radical Democrats, so that the ever more sophisticated means had to be devised to reduce their substantive content. Such problems regularly arise in periods of turmoil and social conflict. After the American Revolution, rebellious and independent farmers had to be taught by force that the ideals expressed in the pamphlets of 1776 were not to be taken seriously. The common people were not to be represented by countrymen like themselves that know the people's sores, but by gentry, merchants, lawyers, and others who hold or serve private power. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison believed that power should be in the hands of the natural aristocracy, Edmund Morgan comments. Men like themselves who would defend property rights against Alexander Hamilton's paper aristocracy, and from the poor. They regarded slaves, paupers, and destitute laborers as an ever present danger to liberty as well as property. The reigning doctrine expressed by the founding fathers, the founding slave owners, is that the people who own the country ought to govern it. That was said by the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. The rise of corporations in the 19th century and the legal structures devised to grant them dominance over private and public life established the victory of the Federalist opponents of popular democracy in a new and powerful form. Not infrequently, revolutionary struggles pit aspirants to power against one another, though united in opposition to radical democratic tendencies among the common people. Lenin and Trotsky, shortly after seizing state power in 1917, moved to dismantle organs of popular control, including factory councils and Soviets, thus proceeding to deter and overcome socialist tendencies. An orthodox Marxist, Lenin did not regard socialism as a viable option in this backward and undeveloped country. Until his last days, it remained for him an elementary truth of Marxism that the victory of socialism requires the joint efforts of workers in a number of advanced countries, Germany in particular. In what has always seemed to me his greatest work, Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell described a similar process in Spain, where the fascists, communists, and liberal democracies were united in opposition to the libertarian revolution that swept over much of the country, turning to the conflict over the spoils only when popular forces were safely suppressed. There are many examples, often influenced by great power violence. This is particularly true in the Third World. A persistent concern of Western elites is that popular organizations might lay the basis for meaningful democracy and social reform, threatening the prerogatives of the privileged. Those who seek to raise the rascal multitude and draw them into associations and combinations with one another against the men of best quality must therefore be repressed or eliminated. It comes as no surprise that Archbishop Oscar Romero should be assassinated shortly after urging President Jimmy Carter to withhold military aid from the governing junta, which he warned would use it to sharpen injustice and repression against the people's organizations struggling for respect or for their most basic human rights. The Archbishop had put his finger on the very problem that must be overcome, whatever euphemisms and tortured argument are used to conceal that fundamental fact. Accordingly, his request for a guarantee that the U.S. government will not intervene directly or indirectly with military, economic, diplomatic, or other pressure in determining the destiny of the Salvadoran people was denied with the promise that aid to the military junta would be reassessed should evidence of misuse develop. The Archbishop was assassinated, and the security forces turned to the task of demolishing the people's organizations by savage atrocities, beginning with the Rio São Paulo massacre, concealed by the loyal media. It also comes as no surprise that the Human Rights Administration should see no misuse developing as the atrocities mounted, except briefly when American churchwomen were raped, tortured, and murdered so that a cover up had to be arranged, or that the media and intellectual opinion should largely disregard the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, which did not even merit an editorial in the New York Times, conceal the complicity of the armed forces and the civilian government established by the United States as a cover for their necessary work, suppress reports on the growing state terror by church and human rights groups and a congressional delegation, and even pretend that there is no real argument that most of the estimated 10,000 political fatalities in 1980 were victims of government forces or irregulars associated with them, as reported by the Washington Post. When a job is to be done, we must set to it without sentimentality. Human rights concerns are fine when they can be used as an ideological weapon to undermine enemies or to restore popular faith in the nobility of the state. But they are not to interfere with serious matters, such as dispersing and crushing the rascal multitude, forming associations against the interests of the men of best quality. The same dedicated commitment to necessary terror was revealed a decade later, in March 1990, when the Archbishop's assassination was commemorated in El Salvador in an impressive 3-day ceremony. The poor, the humble, and the devout flocked by the thousands to honor Archbishop Oscar Romero's memory at a mass in the cathedral where he was murdered, the wire services reported, filling the plaza and the streets outside after a march led by 16 bishops, 3 from the United States. Archbishop Oscar Romero was formally proposed for sainthood by the Salvadoran Church, the first such case since Thomas A. Becket was assassinated at the altar over 800 years ago. America's Watch published a report on the shameful decade symbolically bounded by these two events: the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1980 and the slaying of the Jesuit priests in 1989, which offer harsh testimony about who really rules El Salvador and how little they have changed. People for whom priest killing is still a preferred option because they simply will not hear the cries for change and justice in a society that has had too little of either. In his homily, Archbishop Oscar Romero's successor, Archbishop Arturo Rivera y Damas, said, "For being the voice of those without voice, he was violently silenced." The victims remain without voice, and the Archbishop remains silenced as well. No high-ranking official of the Cristiani government or his arena party attended the Mass. Not even their leader, Roberto de Abusin, assumed to be responsible for the assassination in coordination with the U.S.-backed security forces. The U.S. government was also notable for its absence. The ceremony in El Salvador passed with scarcely a notice in the country, the United States, that funds and trains the assassins. Commemorations at home also escape the attention of the national press. There should be no further embarrassment, however, assuming that there is any now. This will be the last public religious homage to Archbishop Oscar Romero for decades, because church doctrine prohibits homage to candidates for sainthood. Revulsion at the assassination of Thomas Becket compelled King Henry II, who is held to be indirectly responsible, to do penance at the shrine. One will wait a long time for a proper reenactment, another sign of the progress of civilization. The threat of popular organization to privilege is real enough in itself. Worse still, the rot may spread in the terminology of political elites. There may be a demonstration effect of independent development in a form that attends to the people's sores. As noted earlier, internal documents and even the public record reveal that a driving concern of U.S. planners has been the fear that the virus might spread, infecting regions beyond. This concern breaks no new ground. European statesmen had feared that the American Revolution might lend new strength to the apostles of sedition, said Metternich, and might spread the contagion and the invasion of vicious principles, such as the pernicious doctrines of republicanism and popular self-rule, one of the Tsar's diplomats warned. A century later, the cast of characters was reversed. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, feared that if the Bolshevik disease were to spread, it would leave the ignorant and incapable mass of humanity dominant in the earth. The Bolsheviks, he continued, were appealing to the proletariat of all countries, to the ignorant and mentally deficient who by their numbers are urged to become masters, a very real danger in view of the process of social unrest throughout the world. Again, it is democracy that is the awesome threat. When soldiers and workers' councils made a brief appearance in Germany, Wilson feared that they would inspire dangerous thoughts among the American Negro soldiers returning from abroad. Already he had heard Negro laundresses were demanding more than the going wage, saying that money is as much as mine as it is yours. Businessmen might have to adjust to having workers on their boards of directors, he feared, among other disasters, if the Bolshevik virus were not exterminated. With these dire consequences in mind, the Western invasion of the Soviet Union in 1917 was justified on defensive grounds against the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist order, as said by historian John Lewis Gaddis. And it was only natural that the defense of the United States should extend from invasion of the Soviet Union to Wilson's Red Scare at home. As Robert Lansing explained, force must be used to prevent the leaders of Bolshevism and anarchy from proceeding to organize or preach against government in the United States. The government must not permit these fanatics to enjoy the liberty which they now seek to destroy. The repression launched by the Wilson administration successfully undermined democratic politics, unions,
freedom of the press, and independent thought in the interests of corporate power and the state authorities who represented its interests, all with the approval of the media and elites generally, all in self-defense against the ignorant and mentally deficient majority. Much the same story was reenacted after World War II, again under the pretext of a Soviet threat, in reality to restore submission to the rulers. It is often not appreciated how profound and deeply rooted is the contempt for democracy in the elite culture and the fear it arouses. When political life and independent thought revived in the 1960s, the problem arose again, and the reaction was the same. The Trilateral Commission, bringing together liberal elites from Europe, Japan, and the United States, warned of an impending crisis of democracy as segments of the public sought to enter the political arena. This excess of democracy was posing a threat to the unhampered rule of privileged elites, what is called democracy in political theology. The problem was the usual one. The rabble were trying to arrange their own affairs, gaining control over their communities, and pressing their political demands. There were organizing efforts among young people, ethnic minorities, women, social activists, and others, encouraged by the struggles of benighted masses elsewhere for freedom and independence. More moderation and democracy would be required, the Trilateral Commission concluded. Perhaps a return to the days when President Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as the American rapporteur for the Trilateral Commission, the Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, commented.
Irving Kristol adds that insignificant nations, like insignificant people, can quickly experience delusions of significance. But as a leading neoconservative, he has no time for the softer means of manufacture of consent, which are, in any event, not warranted for insignificant people outside the domains of Western civilization. Hence the delusions of significance must be driven from their tiny minds by force. In truth, the days of gunboat diplomacy are never over. Gunboats are as necessary for international order as police cars are for domestic order. These ideas bring us to the Reagan administration, which established a state propaganda agency, the Office of Public Diplomacy, that was by far the most elaborate in American history, much to the delight of advocates of a powerful and interventionist state who are called conservatives in one of the current corruptions of political discourse. An apt phrase, when the program was exposed, a high official described it as the kind of operation carried out in enemy territory. An apt phrase expressing standard elite attitudes towards the public. Standard elite attitudes see the public as an enemy. In this case, the enemy was not completely subdued. Popular movements deepened their roots and spread into new sectors of the population, and were able to drive the state underground to clandestine, secret terror instead of the more efficient forms of overt violence that Presidents Kennedy and President Johnson could undertake before the public had been aroused. The fears expressed by the men of best quality in the 17th century have become a major theme of intellectual discourse, corporate practice, in the academic social sciences. They were expressed by the influential moralist and foreign affairs advisor Reinhold Niebuhr, who was revered by George Kennan, the Kennedy intellectuals, and many others. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that rationality belongs to the cool observers, while the common person follows not reason but faith. The cool observers, he explained, must recognize the stupidity of the average man and must provide the necessary illusion in the emotionally potent oversimplifications that will keep the naive simpletons on course. As in 1650, it remains necessary to protect the lunatic or distracted person, the ignorant rabble, from their own depraved and corrupt judgments, just as one does not allow a child to cross the street without supervision. In accordance with the prevailing conceptions, there is no infringement of democracy if a few corporations control the information system. In fact, that is the essence of democracy, a few corporations that control the information system. In our case, U.S. mass media. The leading figure of the public relations industry, Edward Bernays, explained that the very essence of the democratic process is the freedom to persuade and suggest, what he calls the engineering of consent. If the freedom to persuade happens to be concentrated in a few hands, we must recognize that such is the nature of a free society. Since the early 20th century, the public relations industry has devoted huge resources to educating the American people about the economic facts of life to ensure a favorable climate for business. The public relations industry's task is to control the public mind, which is the only serious danger confronting the company, an AT&T executive observed 80 years ago. And today, the Wall Street Journal describes with enthusiasm the concerted efforts of corporate America to change the attitudes and values of workers on a vast scale with new age workshops and other contemporary devices of indoctrination and stupefaction designed to convert worker apathy into corporate allegiance. The agents of Reverend Moon and Christian evangelicals employ similar devices to bar the threat of peasant organizing and to undermine a church that serves the poor in Latin America, aided by intelligence agencies and the closely linked international organizations of the ultra-right. Edward Bernays expressed the basic point in a 1928 public relations manual titled Propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. Given its enormous and decisive power, the highly class-conscious business community of the United States has been able to put these lessons to effective use. Edward Bernays' advocacy of propaganda is cited by Thomas McCann, head of public relations for the United Fruit Company, for which Edward Bernays provided signal service in preparing the ground for the overthrow of Guatemalan democracy in 1954, a major triumph of business propaganda with the willing compliance of the media. The intelligent minorities have long understood this to be their function. Walter Lippmann described a revolution in the practice of democracy as the manufacture of consent has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. This is a natural development when public opinion cannot be trusted. In the absence of institutions and education by which the environment is so successfully reported that the realities of public life stand out very sharply against self-centered opinion, the common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality and are thus able to perceive the realities. These are the men of best quality who alone are capable of social and economic management. It follows that two political roles must be clearly distinguished, Lippmann goes on to explain. First, there's the role assigned to the specialized class, the insiders, the responsible men who have access to information and understanding. Ideally, they should have a special education for public office and should master the criteria for solving the problems of society. And the degree to which these criteria can be made exact and objective political decision, which is their domain, is actually brought into relation with the interests of men. The public men are furthermore to lead opinion and take the responsibility for the formation of sound public opinion. They initiate, they administer, they settle, and should be protected from ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the general public, who are incapable of dealing with the substance of the problem. The criteria we apply to government are success in satisfying material and cultural wants, not whether it vibrates to the self-centered opinions that happen to be floating in men's minds. Having mastered the criteria for political decision, the specialized class, protected from public meddling, will serve the public interest, what is called the national interest, in the webs of mystification spun by the academic social sciences and political commentary. The second role is the task of the public, which is much more limited. It is not for the public, Walter Lippmann observes, to pass judgment on the intrinsic merits of an issue or to offer analysis or solutions, but merely on occasion to place its force at the disposal of one or another group of responsible men. The public does not reason, investigate, invent, persuade, bargain, or settle. Rather, the public acts only by aligning itself as the partisan of someone in a position to act executively, once he is given the matter at hand sober and disinterested thought. It is for this reason that the public must be put in its place. The bewildered herd, trampling and roaring, has its function to be the interested spectators of action, not participants. Participation is the duty of the responsible man. These ideas, described by Walter Lippmann's editors as a progressive political philosophy for liberal democracy, have an unmistakable resemblance to the Leninist concept of a vanguard party that leads the masses to a better life that they cannot conceive or construct on their own. In fact, the transition from one position to the other, from Leninist enthusiasm to celebration of America, has proven quite an easy one over the years. This is not surprising since the doctrines are similar at their root. The critical difference lies in assessment of the prospects for power through exploitation of mass popular struggle or service to the current masters. There is clearly enough an unspoken assumption behind the proposals of Walter Lippmann and others. The specialized class are offered the opportunity to manage public affairs by virtue of their subordination to those with real power. And our society's dominant business interests are those with real power, a crucial fact that is ignored in the self-praise of the elect. Walter Lippmann's thinking on these matters dates from shortly after World War I, when the liberal intellectual community was much impressed with its success in serving as the faithful and helpful interpreters of what seems to be one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president, the new republic.
The enterprise was Woodrow Wilson's interpretation of his electoral mandate for peace without victory as the occasion for pursuing victory without peace, with the assistance of the liberal intellectuals, who later praised themselves for having imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, with the aid of propaganda fabrications about Hun atrocities and other such devices. They were serving, often unwittingly, as instruments of the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. 15 years later, the influential political scientist Harold Lasswell explained in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences that when elites lack the requisite force to compel obedience, social managers must turn to a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. Harold Lasswell added the conventional justification: we must recognize the ignorance and stupidity of the masses and not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They're not, and we must control them for their own good. The same principle guides the business community. Others have developed similar ideas and put them into practice in the ideological institutions, the schools, the universities, the popular media, the elite journals, and so on. A challenge to these ideas arouses trepidation, sometimes fury, as in the 1960s, when students, instead of simply bowing to authority, began to ask too many questions and to explore beyond the bounds established for them. The pretense of manning the ramparts against the onslaught of the barbarians, now a popular pose, is scarcely more than comical fraud. The doctrines of Walter Lippmann, Harold Lasswell, and others are entirely natural in any society in which power is narrowly concentrated, but formal mechanisms exist by which ordinary people may, in theory, play some role in shaping their own affairs, a threat that plainly must be barred. The techniques of manufacture of consent are most finely honed in the United States, a more advanced business-run society than its allies, and one that is in important ways more free than elsewhere, so that the ignorant and stupid masses are more dangerous. But the same concerns arise in Europe as in the past, heightened by the fact that the European varieties of state capitalism have not yet progressed as far as the United States in eliminating labor unions and other impediments to rule by men, and occasionally women, of best quality, thus restricting politics to factions of the business party. The basic problem, recognized throughout, is that as the state loses the capacity to control the population by force, privileged sectors must find other methods to ensure that the rascal multitude is removed from the public arena, and the insignificant nations must be subjected to the same practices as the insignificant people. Liberal doves hold that others should be free and independent, but not free to choose in ways that we regard as unwise or contrary to our interests. A close counterpart to the prevailing conception of democracy at home as a form of population control. At the other extreme of the spectrum, we find the conservatives, with their preference for a quick resort to Irving Kristol's methods, gunboats and police cars. A properly functioning system of indoctrination has a variety of tasks, some rather delicate. One of its targets is the stupid and ignorant masses. They must be kept that way, diverted with emotionally potent oversimplifications, marginalized and isolated. Ideally, each person should be alone in front of the television screen, watching sports, soap operas, or comedies, deprived of organizational structures that permit individuals lacking resources to discover what they think and believe in interactions with others, to formulate their own concerns and programs, and to act to realize them. They can then be permitted, even encouraged, to ratify the decisions of their betters in periodic elections. The rascal multitude are the proper targets of the mass media and a public education system geared to obedience and training and needed skills, including the skill of repeating patriotic slogans on timely occasions. For submissiveness to become a reliable trait, it must be entrenched in every realm. The public are to be observers, not participants, consumers of ideology as well as products. Eduardo Galeano writes that the majority must resign itself to the consumption of fantasy. Illusions of wealth are sold to the poor, illusions of freedom to the oppressed, dreams of victory to the defeated, and of power to the weak. Nothing less will do. The problem of indoctrination is a bit different for those expected to take part in serious decision making and control, the business, state, and cultural managers in articulate sectors generally. They must internalize the values of the system and share the necessary illusions that permit it to function in the interests of concentrated power and privilege, or at least be cynical enough to pretend that they do, an art that not many can master. But they must also have a certain grasp of the realities of the world, or they will be unable to perform their tasks effectively. The elite media and educational systems must steer a course through these dilemmas, not an easy task, one plagued by internal contradictions. It is intriguing to see how it is faced, but that is beyond the scope of these remarks. For the home front, a variety of techniques of manufacture of consent are required, geared to the intended audience in its ranking on the scale of significance. For those at the lowest rank, and for the insignificant peoples abroad, another device is available, what a leading turn of the century American sociologist, Franklin Henry Giddings, called consent without consent. If in later years the colonized see and admit that the disputed relation was for the highest interest, it may be reasonably held that authority has been imposed with the consent of the governed, as when a parent disciplines an uncomprehending child. Franklin Henry Giddings was referring to the misguided creatures whom we were reluctantly slaughtering in the Philippines for their own good. But the lesson holds more generally. As noted, the Bolshevik overtones are apparent throughout. The systems have crucial differences, but also striking similarities. Walter Lippmann's specialized class and Edward Bernay's intelligent minority, which are to manage the public and their affairs according to liberal democratic theory, correspond to the Leninist vanguard of revolutionary intellectuals. The manufacture of consent advocated by Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Harold Lasswell and others is the agitprop of their Leninist counterparts, following a script outlined by Mikhail Bakunin over a century ago. The secular priesthood in both of the major systems of hierarchy and coercion regard the masses as stupid and incompetent, a bewildered herd who must be driven to a better world, one that we, the intelligent minority, will construct for them, either taking state power ourselves in the Leninist model, or serving the owners and managers of the state capitalist systems if it is impossible to exploit popular revolution to capture the commanding heights. Much as Mikhail Bakunin had predicted long before, the Leninist red bureaucracy moved at once to dismantle organs of popular control, particularly any institutional structures that might provide working people with some influence over their affairs as producers or citizens. Studying Bolshevik development programs from a comparative and historical perspective, Alexander Gershkonkron, studying Bolshevik development programs from a comparative and historical perspective, Alexander Gershkonkron comments that Marxian ideology, or any socialist ideology for that matter, has had a very remote, if any, relation to the great industrial transformation engineered by the Soviet government, including the approximate six-fold increase in the volume of industrial output by the mid-1950s. The greatest and the longest spurt of industrialization in the history of the country's industrial development at an extraordinary human cost, primarily to the peasantry. That the same was true of the organization of production and of social and political life generally is too obvious to require comment. Not surprisingly, the immediate destruction of the incipient socialist tendencies that arose during the ferment of popular struggle in 1917 has been depicted by the world's two great propaganda systems, the United States and Russia, as a victory for socialism. For the Bolsheviks, the goal of the farce was to extract what advantage they could from the moral prestige of socialism. For the West, The purpose was to defame socialism and entrench the system of ownership and management control over all aspects of economic, political, and social life. The collapse of the Leninist system cannot properly be called the victory for socialism, any more than the collapse of Hitler and Mussolini could be described in these terms. But as in those earlier cases, it does eliminate a barrier to the realization of the libertarian socialist ideals of the popular movements that were crushed in Russia in 1917, Germany shortly after, Spain in 1936, and elsewhere, often with the Leninist vanguard leading the way and taming the rascal multitude with their libertarian, socialist, and radical democratic aspirations. David Hume posed his paradox for both despotic and more free societies. The latter case is by far the more important. As the social world becomes more free and diverse, the task of inducing submission becomes more complex, and the problem of unraveling the mechanisms of indoctrination more challenging. But intellectual interest aside, the case of free societies has greater human significance, because here we are talking about ourselves and can act upon what we learn. It is for just this reason that the dominant culture will always seek to externalize human concerns, directing them to the inadequacies and abuses of others. When U.S. plans go awry in some corner of the third world, we devote our attention to the defects and special problems of these cultures and their social disorders, not our own. Fame, fortune, and respect await those who reveal the crimes of official enemies. Those who undertake the vastly more important task of raising a mirror to their own societies can expect quite different treatment. George Orwell is famous for Animal Farm in 1984, which focus on the official enemy. Had George Orwell addressed the more interesting and significant question of thought control in relatively free and democratic societies, it would not have been appreciated, and instead of wide acclaim, he would have faced silent dismissal or obloquy. Let us nevertheless turn to the more important and unacceptable questions. Keeping to governments that are more free and popular, why do the governed submit when force is on their side? First, we have to look at a prior question. To what extent is force on the side of the governed? Here, some care is necessary. Societies are considered free and democratic, and so far as the state's power to coerce is limited. The United States is unusual in this respect. Perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, the citizen is free from state coercion, at least the citizen who is relatively privileged and of the right color, a substantial part of the population. But it is a mere truism that the state represents only one segment of the nexus of state corporate power. Control over investment, production, commerce, finance, conditions of work, and other crucial aspects of social policy lies in private hands. Unwillingness to adapt to the structure of authority and domination carries costs, ranging from state force to the costs of privation and struggle. Even an individual of independent mind can hardly fail to compare these to the benefits, however meager, that accrue to submission. Meaningful choices are thus narrowly limited. Similar factors limit the range of ideas and opinion in obvious ways. Articulate expression is shaped by the same private powers that control the economy. It is largely dominated, the economy, by major corporations that sell audiences to advertisers and naturally reflect the interest of the owners in their market. The ability to articulate and communicate one's views, concerns, and interests, or even to discover them, is thus narrowly constrained as well. Denial of these truisms about effective power is at the heart of the structure of necessary illusion. Thus, a media critic reviewing a book on the press in the New York Times refers without argument to the traditional Jeffersonian role of the press as counterbalance to government power. The phrase encapsulates three crucial assumptions: one historical, one descriptive, one ideological. The historical claim is that Jefferson was a committed advocate of freedom of the press, which is false. The second is that the press, in fact, functions as a counterbalance to government rather than as a faithful servant, presented here as doctrine, thus evading any need to face the massive array of detailed documentation that refutes this dogma. The ideological principle is that Jeffersonian libertarianism, considered abstractly apart from its realization in practice, would demand that the press be a counterbalance to government power. That is incorrect. The libertarian conception is that the press should be independent, hence a counterbalance to centralized power of any form. In Jefferson's day, the powers that loom large were the state, the church, and feudal structures. Shortly after, new forms of centralized power emerged in the world of corporate capitalism. A Jeffersonian would hold, then, that the press should be a counterbalance to state or corporate power, and critically to the state corporate power nexus. But to raise this point carries us into forbidden ground. Apart from the general constraints on choice and articulate opinion inherent in the concentration of private power, it also sets narrow limits on the actions of government. The United States has again been unusual in this respect among the industrial democracies, though convergence towards the U.S. pattern is evident elsewhere. The United States is near the limit in its safeguards for freedom from state coercion, and also in the poverty of its political life. There is essentially one political party, the business party, with two factions, Democrats and Republicans. Shifting coalitions of investors account for a large part of political history. Unions or other popular organizations that might offer a way for the general public to play some role in influencing programs and policy choices scarcely function apart from the narrowest realm. The ideological system is bounded by the consensus of the privileged. Elections are largely a ritual form. In congressional elections, virtually all incumbents are returned to office, a reflection of the vacuity of the political system and the choices it offers. There is scarcely a pretense that substantive issues are at stake in the presidential campaigns. Articulated programs are hardly more than a device to garner votes and candidates adjust their messages to their audiences as public relations tacticians advise. Political commentators ponder such questions as whether Reagan will remember his lines, or whether Mondale looks too gloomy, or whether Dukakis can duck the slime flung at him by George Bush's speechwriters. In the 1984 elections, the two political factions, Democrats and Republicans, virtually exchanged traditional policies. The Republicans presenting themselves as the party of Keynesian growth and state intervention in the economy, the Democrats as the advocates of fiscal conservatism. Few even noticed. Half the population does not bother to mark the ballots, and those who take the trouble often consciously vote against their own interest. The public is granted an opportunity to ratify decisions made elsewhere in accord with the prescriptions of Walter Lippmann and other democratic theorists. The public may select among personalities put forth in a game of symbolic politics that only the most naive take very seriously. When they do, they are mocked by sophisticates. Criticism of President Bush's call for revenue enhancement after winning the election by the firm and eloquent promise not to raise taxes is a political cheap shot. Harvard political scientist and media specialist Marty Linsky comments under the heading Campaign Pledges Made to be Broken. When Bush won the election by leading the public in the Read My Lips, No New Taxes chant, he was merely expressing his worldview, making a statement of his hopes. Those who thought he was promising no new taxes do not understand that elections and governing are different ballgames, played with different objectives and rules. The purpose of elections is to win, Linsky correctly observes, expressing the cynicism of the sophisticated, and the purpose of governing is to do the best for the country. He adds, parroting the necessary illusions that respectability demands. These tendencies were accelerated during the Reagan years. The population overwhelmingly opposed the policies of the Reagan administration, and even the Reagan voters in 1984, by about 3-2, hoped that his legislative program would not be enacted. In the 1980 elections, 4% of the electorate voted for Reagan because they regarded him as a real conservative. In 1984, this dropped to 1%. That is what is called a landslide victory for conservatism in political rhetoric. Furthermore, contrary to much pretense, Reagan's popularity was never particularly high, and much of the population seemed to understand that he was a media creation who had only the foggiest idea of what government policy might be. It is noteworthy that the fact is now tacitly conceded, the instant that the great communicator was no longer of any use as a symbol, he was quietly tucked away. After 8 years of pretense about the revolution that Reagan wrought, no one would dream of asking its standard bearer for his thoughts about any topic, because it is understood, as it always was, that he has none. When Reagan was invited to Japan as an elder statesman, his hosts were surprised, and given the fat fee, a bit annoyed to discover that he could not hold press conferences or talk on any subject. Their discomfiture aroused some amusement in the American press. The Japanese believed what they had read about this remarkable figure, failing to comprehend the workings of the mysterious Occidental mind. The hoax perpetuated by the media and the intellectual community is of some interest for David Hume's paradox about submission to authority. State capitalist democracy has a certain tension with regard to the locus of power. In principle, the people rule, but effective power resides largely in private hands, with large-scale effects throughout the social order. One way to reduce the tension is to remove the public from the scene, except in form. The Reagan phenomenon offered a new way to achieve this fundamental goal of capitalist democracy. The office of chief executive was in effect eliminated in favor of symbolic figure constructed by the public relations industry to perform certain ritual tasks, to appear on ceremonial occasions, to greet visitors, read government pronouncements, and so on. This is a major advance in the marginalization of the public. As the most sophisticated of the state capitalist democracies, the United States has often led the way in devising means to control the domestic enemy, and the latest inspiration will doubtless be mimicked elsewhere with the usual time lag. Even when issues arise in the political system, the concentration of effective power limits the threat. The question is largely academic in the United States because of the subordination of the political and ideological system to business interests. But in democracies to the south, where conflicting ideas and approaches reach the political arena, the situation is different. As is again familiar, government policies that private power finds unwelcome will lead to capital flight, disinvestment, and social decline until business confidence is restored with the abandonment of the threat to privilege. These facts of life exert a decisive influence on the political system, with military force in reserve if matters get out of hand, supported or applied by the North American enforcer. To put the basic point crassly, unless the rich and powerful are satisfied, everyone will suffer because they control the basic social levers, determining what will be produced and consumed and what crumbs will filter down to their subjects. For the homeless in the streets, then, the primary objective is to ensure that the rich live happily in their mansions. This crucial factor, along with simple control over resources, severely limits the force on the side of the governed and diminishes David Hume's paradox in a well-functioning capitalist democracy in which the general public is scattered and isolated.
Understanding of these basic conditions, tacit or explicit, has long served as a guide for policy. Once popular organizations are dispersed or crushed, and decision-making power is firmly in the hands of owners and managers, democratic forms are quite acceptable, even preferable as a device of legitimation of elite rule in a business-run democracy. The pattern was followed by U.S. planners in reconstructing the industrial societies after World War II and is standard in the Third World, though assuring stability of the desired kind is far more difficult there, except by state terror.